Okay, so let's go on to the next step then. So that was the light reactions. The dark reactions are also called the Calvin cycle or the light independent reactions. The Calvin cycle, named after the scientist who first figured out what all the steps were, it's like the citric acid cycle, and it's a cycle because we keep regenerating the starting material. But this is where our energy is going to be used. So the Calvin cycle is going to take carbon dioxide, attach it to a larger molecule, and reduce it using NADPH, because glucose, to go from carbon dioxide to glucose, carbon dioxide is going to be reduced. So, and our first sugar that's an output is G3P, the same molecule that we saw as an intermediate in glycolysis. Partway between glucose and pyruvate in respiration, we had G3P being produced. So that's why I mentioned that this is an important metabolic intermediate. G3P can leave and it can come and go from respiration and photosynthesis. So this is the first product of photosynthesis, of the synthesis reactions, and two G3Ps can be fused together to make one glucose molecule. So the Calvin cycle, we have carbon fixation, and remember we have this old-fashioned use of the word fix, which means attach. And the enzyme that catalyzes carbon fixation is called RuBisCO, and we'll talk more about that. It's an oxidation reduction reaction. NADH is going to be oxidized, or not NADH, NADPH is going to be oxidized back to NADP plus as part of this reaction, and CO2 is going to be reduced. And we're also going to regenerate ribulose bisphosphate, which is the CO2 acceptor. Okay, so here's the important reaction here in the Calvin cycle. We have our 5-carbon intermediate here, which is a 5-carbon sugar, ribulose bisphosphate, because there's just a spelling rule here that instead of biphosphate, meaning 2 phosphates, you can see that there's 2, we say bisphosphate. So RuBP is ribulose bisphosphate. RuBisCO is the enzyme that catalyzes this reaction. And the real way we should write RuBisCO is like this, because it's actually an acronym for a really long name of an enzyme, ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase oxidase. And because nobody wants to say that over and over again, we just shorten it to RuBisCO. But that's why we should write it this way: ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase oxidase. It's an extremely common protein, and it might be the most important enzyme in photosynthesis, because it is what actually takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from water, if it's an aquatic organism, and attaches it to a larger molecule. So this enzyme you need to know. RuBisCO is the name of the enzyme. Ribulose bisphosphate is a molecule. It's not the name of the enzyme. RuBisCO takes carbon dioxide and attaches it to ribulose bisphosphate. And then we have several reactions here, which you don't need to know the details of, but ATP is used to destabilize bonds to make things more able to react, and NADPH is used to reduce carbons. So we end up with G3P as an output here. So and then we regenerate our starting material. So the most important things to know for all of these is what goes in and what comes out. So for the Calvin cycle, what goes in is carbon dioxide and energy in the form of ATP and high energy electrons in NADPH. That's what goes into this reaction. What comes out of the Calvin cycle is sugar and our regenerated oxidized electron carrier, NADP+. So carbon dioxide is reduced, and energy from the light reactions is used for this process. And the only enzyme along the way here, that this is a very multi-step process, the only enzyme you need to know the name of is RuBisCO. So the number of carbons in the intermediates change here. We go from a 5-carbon ribulose bisphosphate to 3 carbons. 3-carbon unit is removed, and then we regenerate our 5-carbon unit. So the sun is the source of energy for almost 100% of life on Earth. Just some cheme autotrophic bacteria don't use sunlight as the ultimate source of energy. Almost all life that's not photosynthetic, so that would include us, is dependent on photosynthetic organisms for energy. Whether you're eating the plants directly or you're eating animals that ate the plants, you're still ultimately getting 100% of your energy from photosynthesis. We talked about the 2 steps, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle, or the dark reactions. The light reactions are the photo part of photosynthesis. The Calvin cycle is the synthesis part of photosynthesis. Remember, synthesis means taking smaller bits and sticking them together into a larger thing. So carbon dioxide are the smaller bits, sticking them together into a sugar molecule. That's why we call it synthesis. So the photoreactions occur in the thylakoid membranes, and that's what the photosystems are doing, and the electron transport chain that's embedded in the thylakoid membranes. And the synthesis reactions occur in the stroma of the chloroplast. So there are other things that are made that plants make, obviously, besides sugar. And just like with respiration, we can use fats and proteins for energy as well as sugars. The same thing is true for plants. Even though G3P is the initial product of photosynthesis, they have mitochondria too, and they can use that as well to make the other building blocks that they need to make fatty acids and amino acids. So plants, just using this energy, they can not only make carbohydrates, but they can make proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids as well, besides producing oxygen for our atmosphere. So 100% of the oxygen in our atmosphere today is continuously being produced by photosynthetic organisms. So here's our summary here. So in the light reactions, we have photosystem 2, which produces oxygen as a byproduct, passes on electrons to the electron transport chain. We have photosystem 1, which accepts those electrons, bounces them up to a higher energy level, and uses them to produce NADPH. We have 2 forms of energy then going on to the synthesis reactions, and the electrons from NADPH are being used to reduce CO2 to sugar, and the ATP is being used for destabilizing bonds in order for reactions to be spontaneous so that they can occur. So here's our linear electron flow again: photosystem 2, electron transport chain, photosystem 1 to the enzyme that reduces NADP plus to NADPH.